So now, it's a really great honor and a delight for me on behalf of the board of the Swedish Association for the Highly Sensitive to present to you the Honorable Dr. Elaine Aron, psychologist, researcher, and author. And Dr. Elaine Aron was also the one who introduced the expression HSP, or highly sensitive person, which also was the name of her most read, I guess. It's read by over 1 million people around the world. The book of the highly sensitive person that first came out in 1996, according to my Swedish edition. She's the first therapist to tell HSPs how to identify their trait and make the most of it. Many of us here today is most thankful to the research you have conducted. So please welcome Dr. Elaine Aron. The screen is yours.
Well, I am so glad to be here, and thank you, all of you on the board and all of you who are here. It's such an honor to have so many from Sweden. I was trying to remember that someone once told me that Sweden is the most highly sensitive country, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I do. I was saying earlier that I'm very partial to Sweden, so it was easy for me to say yes to doing this. And I appreciate all the good questions that were sent in, and I will answer most of them. Certainly I have, I think, not always specifically, but I think I've got most of it covered. So I'll start. I like to start with, I like to do the questions because I like to know what people really want to hear. And of course, there's always some things that others didn't want to hear, but that still, it gives me a shot at it being what you want to hear rather than me going off on some subject. So the questions fell into 6 topics, but I'll just talk about the trait first. But the 6 topics were general questions that were kind of quick to answer, and then dealing with culture and society, which I think is what we're often kind of up against right now. Living with the trait, which of course we all are, but maybe living better with the trait. Highly sensitive people in the workplace, and that's an understandable topic. Okay, so those are the questions, but first I want to review the basics in case somebody's here who hasn't heard them, or just because it's good to repeat. And so I always start with DOES, which isn't in the first book. I came up with it when I was writing the therapy book, actually, and I just realized, oh, this works. And so I don't know the letters in Swedish, but in English, depth of processing is the first one, D, because it is so essential to everything else. And I think you can understand why that would be. Because it's depth of processing that makes us get overstimulated because we're processing everything so deeply. And that is the only problem we really have with the trait. And I'll talk about that in the part about living with the trait. The other 3 letters are all pluses, I think. We're more emotionally responsive and have more empathy. And actually that may promote the depth of processing as much as the other way around, depth of processing promoting the emotions. They both happen because you don't think about anything deeply unless you care about it. So because we care about so many things, we think about those things more deeply than other people do. And then there's the sensitive to subtle stimuli, the last letter, which is kind of included in all the others, but it's just something that one has to say, because besides noticing loud things or big things, we also notice the very small things. There's just another letter I have to add, or 2 letters, and that's differential susceptibility, which is really key to the trait. And we didn't know about this until about the time of DOES, but not so thoroughly. And that is that because we pick up on our environment so thoroughly, we pick up on both the good and the bad. In fact, if anything, we pick up on more of the good more of the positive things that happen to us than the negative. Our brains are more responsive than other people to the positive. This may be because for survival, almost everyone has to be responsive to the negative, but positive is what makes this differential susceptibility, because if you are grow up in a comfortable family where there's lots of positive, you are working in a positive environment, but especially true for childhood, then you grow up with your sensitivity mostly an asset, and there's not much depression or anxiety, those things that for those who've had a difficult childhood, those are very much more present. And I like to emphasize this. Well, for one thing, we also are more affected by interventions. So you don't have to feel hopeless about a bad childhood, because things you do to improve how you live with it, to reduce its impact on you, reduce the triggers that can disturb you, or the general feeling that life is kind of hopeless or something to worry about. Those things decrease as you work on that childhood issues stuff. So it's not a hopeless situation at all, but it is a good reason to go back, maybe do some therapy, read books, whatever works for you, to reduce the impact of whatever was negative in your childhood. So an interesting thing about this is that I think that the public tends to recognize sensitive people, to put it another way, those who've had a more difficult childhood, who are anxious, who are depressed, who feel threatened by things, and they're more noticeable. They may complain more about their environment because it feels to them like their environment is just closing in on them or having a negative impact on them. So I think we tend to get stereotyped as being more maybe disturbed as we actually are on average, because these more high functioning, highly sensitive people are just blend in. In fact, that's part of our trait, isn't it? Is to blend in, to be able to adapt to where we are. And if there's a problem, we just deal with it quietly, and we don't live or work or deal too much with people who don't make us pretty happy. And we've figured out how to do that. So I had an interesting experience. I don't think Michael Plewis would mind my telling this story. Michael Plewis is one of our main researchers. We always thought he was not highly sensitive. That's what he said. Finally, one day he said, see, all of his graduate students are highly sensitive. He just married someone who's highly sensitive. He said, I've been thinking maybe I'm highly sensitive. And the reason he didn't know it was that, he's white, male, with a wonderful family who support him whatever he wanted to do. He's Swiss. I mean, he had a lot of the right cards to play a hand where he would not really struggle much with his sensitivity. He knew how to deal with it. He worked with a very difficult person for a while as a graduate student whom I know well, and he did fine with it. So that's just part of the wonders of our trait that people don't see. People notice these sensitive people as highly creative, as very sweet and empathic, as doing very well. It's charming that they like their solitude. Maybe it's nice that they pick quiet restaurants, but there's not that much notice of their meeting their own needs. And therefore, there was a question that came in, basically, could we work towards having high sensitivity as a diagnosis? Because then sensitive people who are struggling would get more attention in good ways for help with their problem, their disorder. And I, of course, have always been pretty opposed to that, because I don't want us to be seen in that way, because so many of us are not struggling with a disorder. So that's how we begin. Then introversion and extroversion, as most of you know, there are at least 30% of sensitive people who are extroverts. And that's been confusing for people because so much of the image of introversion, especially with Susan Cain's book, Quiet, was basically as though all sensitive people are introverts or all introverts are highly sensitive. And no, neither of those are true. In fact, we can also be high sensation seekers, which is very interesting. Most of the people who interview me are actually high sensation seekers. So, and that's because the opposite of sensitivity is not seeking sensation, but it is not being impulsive. We think before we act. We process things deeply. And so the opposite of sensitivity is impulsiveness, much more than it is anything to do with avoiding sensation. And there are equal numbers of men and women, which is a struggle in most Western cultures for sensitive men to even know they're highly sensitive or to feel good about their trait, because the norm for a man has been something else. But you'll be glad to know, unfortunately, we declared last year, 2020, is the year of the highly sensitive man. I said, maybe it's going to have to be a decade of the highly sensitive man, because there's a lot of work to do in this area. I was just talking to Will Harper last night about the movie they're making, and they have a new title for it after they asked men to make suggestions, which was a good idea. It is The Genius of Sensitivity, Redefining Masculinity. That's a good title. And he's getting lots of geniuses into the movie. People are stepping forward. If you know anyone who just really is one of these outstanding, highly sensitive men, I'm sure Will would like to know about it, because he's putting together just a beautiful, beautiful film. It's been a little hard gathering enough funds for this, but I think he's going to do it. And I think highly sensitive people are a little burned out on donating to films. But the only thing to remember is that Sensitive: The Untold Story has just had a huge impact. You know, it is among the 30 most popular documentaries on Amazon. I think you probably get Amazon. It's a big thing here, of all time. That's how many people are watching it. So, and it's just entertaining, and it's not hard to pull it up and show it to people. Someone wanted me to talk about the acronym style that I created for highly sensitive men. I'm not sure that they've picked up on this very much, but I like it, so I'll read it through. S is for strategic, or depth of processing and action. This thing of and this is true throughout the animal kingdom, that males have to act and keep their eye on other males, especially those who are more aggressive, and therefore you have to have a strategy. I'll tell you the story now. I had it a little later, but I think it's a good one about. Watch, if you can, the video on the black wolf of Yellowstone National Park. It's a wonderful example of a highly sensitive animal. This wolf, you know, he had to mate, he had to reproduce. So among other things, I mean, he avoided fights. So he'd wait for the other males to go off, and the females apparently adored him. So he got to mate lots of times. When the males would catch him around the females, they would chase him like crazy. And, you know, most male wolves die in fights with other male wolves. But there's a road in Yellowstone that the wolves will not cross, because they've seen wolves get hit, and it's not a place they ever go across that road. But he does. So he'd cross the road, and the wolves would be on the other side, all growling and mad, and he'd be safe. And so, talk about depth of processing, of noticing the details in his environment and what he has to do to survive. The second letter in style, which is the English word for, we talk about temperament sometimes as a style with which someone does everything in their life. So that's why I like style. T for testosterone. People think of sensitive men sometimes as being feminine, but they're not. No way you're feminine if you got testosterone. I think it'll be interesting to study more about the differences between sensitive men and women. Y is for wise yielding, to live to fight another day, as the saying goes, and in another way. And so I describe the Black Wolf of Yellowstone as yielding. It's also a strategy in the martial arts, especially judo. Use the other's energy and attack in your own movement. When they're coming at you, you just let them. You do a little bit to make them go past you and fly onto the floor, and that way you preserve your own mental and physical well-being. The L is for leadership, and if you've never looked at John Hughes's little essay on leadership in highly sensitive men, it's a very nice piece. And I think we often are leaders, although often not noticeable leaders, because we hold back and let others move forward and then do our own leading at just the right time. And the last letter is E for empathy, which can be used in close relationships, but also in leadership in all kinds of situations. And it doesn't always have to be used for helping, because empathy is a way of knowing what your opponent's likely to do. So that's a kind of cognitive empathy. So I'll just do the questions about men and then move into the other questions. Do highly sensitive men have some kind of moral code or wisdom? And would this be connected to priestly advisors? I'm always careful to say things, at least in general public, that imply that highly sensitive people are superior in some way, because part of the wisdom I'd like all of us to carry is that there is a tendency in human beings, it's a natural instinct to have in-groups and out-groups. That's a tendency to take everything and have opposites and then have preferences in those opposites, like black-white or London-Paris or north-south or east-west. And dog-cat, we hear, and we immediately know that one of them is a little bit more our favorite for some reason. So it's a survival thing to know who we should protect and who we maybe should watch out for. But we really don't need that in this world. We need us to transcend that instinct, all human beings, so that all living things are in group and there is no out group. So I think we can do it, but it takes overcoming an instinct. We've overcome other instincts, we can overcome this one too. So I'm careful about that but having said that, I think, and also there will be exceptions. I have met highly sensitive people who've been quite difficult, or maybe not in this tendency of a moral code or even wisdom. So I don't like making generalizations. And those things happen because of environment and possibly other genes. So we're not just highly sensitive. But the one item on the self-test is conscientiousness, and certainly that's one basis of a moral code. Getting the bigger picture and then seeing what needs to be done. And if you're not familiar with that term, priestly advisor, I used it in the first book. I've done a lot of study of Indo-European culture and Indo-Europeans and many other cultures. I just realized the Hawaiians have the same division. There's the leaders and there are the priests or the priestly advisors who are often studying things more carefully and then advise the leaders who tend to be more impulsive and wanting to run off to war. So I think of us as priestly advisors. I don't know that it would be absolutely true, because these days, well, in those days, priests became a class, and who got into the class, whether they were highly sensitive, might not have made them all highly sensitive. So I wonder if you could distinguish between sensitivity and vulnerability. Just going back to Indo-European again, that division between priest and leaders, or church and state, or we see it even, and we have the chief executive, the president, who's really in charge of all the armed forces, and then we have the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be standing back, not advising, but Supreme Court and the Congress together can advise the president or make decisions that come from a different place of long study. So the distinction between sensitivity and vulnerability, some think it is the same, especially for men. Sensitivity is not about being fragile. Well, that's true, and that's why I like that idea of sensitivity being strategic, and choosing not to be in a fight because you live longer that way, and you don't have as many injuries. So you can see it as a being smart. But this differential diagnosis, it is true that the wonderful term here is susceptibility to our environment. We're different and we're more susceptible to our environment. That means that, you wouldn't want to be invulnerable in a positive environment. People who are resilient tend to miss out on the positive environments because they're not as affected by their environment. So sensitive is the right word, or susceptible? General questions, quickies mostly. Someone was saying, what about the organic part of sensitivity? For instance, sensitivity to alcohol, coffee, food, medication. We have research of the caffeine is right in the self-test that it's part of being highly sensitive, and most people say they're more sensitive to caffeine. You can get used to caffeine, but if you aren't used to it or don't choose to get used to it, it can keep you awake at night. Medication, we're about to publish a study, I think I can say that. Well, yes, there is research, it's not published yet, that we are more sensitive to medication, or we report ourselves as being. Food allergies, I don't think are particularly have to do with being highly sensitive. But about grass allergy, skin allergies, Jerome Kagan found that to be true of what he called inhibited children. So it's probably true for us. Lots of questions about, do highly sensitive people have more chronic fatigue, or more irritable bowel syndrome, or difficulty with menopause, or different questions that people tend to ask. Very, very hard to do research on that, because you can't just ask highly sensitive people and find out that maybe they have more than the average population, because you're not necessarily getting all highly sensitive people. You have to have a sample of a perfect kind of sample, like we try to do with elections, where you have you have people from every walk of life and all over the country, so that you have something that's close to being typical of every single highly sensitive person. And that is just that's pretty hard to do. But people make statements because they've seen more highly sensitive people in their clinic, for instance, or in treatment for something. But that's differential susceptibility. We don't know how much stress and past environment has caused the problem that we want to say is more typical of highly sensitive people. So I'm very careful around those things, but we do know some, and they make sense. If we're more sensitive to subtleties, we're going to notice the side effects of medication more completely, even if they're not, in some way, they're not different. I mean, we don't know exactly the mechanisms, but they're all a sensitivity that comes down to our senses have to sense it. Let's see. In your research, you've termed high sensitivity as a personality trait. Actually, I don't think I have, or I haven't very often, because it's really a temperament trait. And there is a difference in psychologists' mind between temperament, which is generally innate, and personality, which is both innate temperament plus environment. So just to be clear, it is a temperament trait and not a personality trait. Although that's a whole controversial area. And so sometimes in order to please a reviewer of a paper, I've had to fudge it a little bit. Fudge it a little bit is an English term for compromise. Let's see. There's a lot of discussion about the common description of our trait and the negative connotation of the word sensitive. I've heard you describe it as a neutral trait, which makes sense. It is a neutral trait. And actually, there are very few words in the English language that can be taken both positively and negatively. And sensitivity is one of them. Spirituality is another one. The people have both positive and negative reactions to these words. And the problem with the negative reaction is much more in the culture than it is with the word, I think, because we have lots of times when we use the word sensitive as a wonderful thing, whether a test is sensitive or a person is sensitive. We love a person who's sensitive and picks up on others' needs. So can't change the term, partly because I like the highly reflective person. I thought that was great because it captures depth of processing. But I needed a term that applied to all animals that were highly sensitive too. We can't think of them as processing things more deeply. We don't know what's going on inside their heads. Plus, I think there was how about neurosensitivity? Well, that's like environmental sensitivity, which Michael Plewis has picked up. But if you want to study high sensitivity, you're studying high environmental sensitivity. It's hard to get away from that highly neurosensitive, not just neurosensitive, which every living thing has to be neurosensitive. So, so maybe what we have to do is change how it's seen rather than change the word. But the men have been using finely tuned nervous system, which I think is fine. Use anything you want, although it gets a little harder as we go on using this word. Okay, and that really does bring us up to the next subject, which is dealing with our culture and society. The first person has something, I quoted it all because it's so true. It's so much a part of the other questions, really. I am wondering why high sensitivity does not seem to be properly recognized within the field of general personality psychology. Maybe it's only in Sweden. Many psychologists and therapists seem skeptical about the research. Well, I'm going to quote Max Planck, the physicist, quote, "Science advances one funeral at a time." The problem is it takes about a generation to get a new idea into medicine or science, into the schools who teach the professionals. So when a person comes out of school thinking he knows everything about pediatrics or about psychology or whatever, or teaching, if he hasn't been taught about temperament, he basically if you tell him about it, it's like you're telling him it's close to shaming someone, like you don't really know this very important thing. And so it just takes time for people to, the good thing about sensitivity, and I think it's maybe true a little bit about homosexuality too, is that everybody knows one. Everybody's got one in their family. So all of a sudden it becomes awkward to go on putting it down in some way. I just saw a little message from Anne, which is good to know, which is that the word personality is used a little differently in Swedish, but I think what I said is still, it's accurate for English. And so I don't know, there may be some problems in how the word trade has been translated in Swedish, but there are those two distinctions, but I hope that helps. And thank you, Anna, for anything that I can say that will clarify anything. She gets to chat. The board gets to chat. I've done some of these Zoom calls where I could see everyone's chat and everyone else could, and it was just horrible for HSPs. We all were screaming with craziness after watching this thing scroll down. Some of them not so positive, and that happens. So if you're not having a not so positive thought, you'll have to sit on it. So this problem of getting the information, and that affects schools. Someone was talking, and I know lots of you feel this way, that the schools don't recognize highly sensitive children, and it's a terrible shame. And this person had done everything they could. There's giving out research and information. There's 20 tips in the back of the highly sensitive child for teachers, which you can copy. Probably 5 tips would be more likely to be read by someone. You could leave it in their lunchroom, or you have to go to the top often and talk to the principal, because it's possible to get someone to come in and speak about it. But what you really need to do is talk about temperament in general, which often teachers haven't been taught about either. It's amazing, in psychology, there's very little on temperament. There's much more on personalities. So this thing of history plus what's innate, but much less attention on what's innate than there is attention on the whole person, you might say. But what's innate is especially affecting children in the classroom. And teachers often think, well, if I have to make adjustments for a few children, that's going to be too much work for me, or they should just get over it. But the fact is that it's less work when you take into account temperament, because like some children have very active physical activity, and you need to get those out to run around a little bit so that they can sit down and work. But if you don't recognize that, you're pushing many children to become an average child, which probably doesn't even exist. We say their average size of a family in the United States is 2.2 children. Well, you've never seen a 0.2 child, and you've never seen a normal kid. They all have temperaments. So the advice that I can give, I got from a teacher, which is watch for the teacher who's best with your sensitive child, who knows, who understands about sensitivity, or understands your child and gets it. Then ask them which other teachers get it. And then you try to move your child into those classrooms as they go up in age. You can ask the principal to say, I know from this teacher that this teacher would be a really good match for my child. And sometimes that works. And you hope that maybe the person you talk to will actually discuss it with other teachers. Those who are more extroverted might just do that. The only other thing I would watch for is bullying, which might be not common in Swedish schools, but kids can do that. And sensitive boys especially can possibly be victims of bullying. And there are things that schools can do about that. It's now understood that it's up to the school to fix that, but they often don't know about it. So sharing the research is good if a person's interested in it. There are so many different ways to get people interested. Research is not always it. What I do sometimes with doctors, and you could probably do it with teachers too, is, I know you have so much experience as a teacher. I bet you've noticed that some children are more sensitive to sound, for instance, and they're more sensitive to criticism. And maybe my child is one of those, and maybe you could do what you do with children who are like that. In other words, tell them that they know about it rather than tell them that they don't know about it. So we're dealing with a culture that doesn't get us most of the time, even in Sweden. We all tend to think everyone's like ourselves until we learn we're highly sensitive, and then we begin to realize maybe most people are not like ourselves. So you have to break through that stereotype in some way, or that assumption, that generalization. And often it works best to, first of all, to pair the positive and the negative. Like maybe they say, boy, you're so sensitive. And you say, well, I know you feel that way, but I know you also like me for my blah, 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 my creativity, empathy, my listening and able to understand you, whatever. That's all part of the same thing. Another thing that I like that someone taught me as a wise, I don't like your sensitivity, it bothers me. Then you say, what about my sensitivity don't you like? Because once you get to specifics, you know a lot more than when people just say, oh, you're too sensitive. And you can say, oh, I like my sensitivity, but what about it that's bothering you? And then you get into the details. Here's a quick question. I can answer. You mentioned anxiety about the climate and sensitive, the untold story, and sensitive and in love. In your book, you mentioned that you were on board Rainbow Warrior. It was not that was a misreading. I was saying that probably the Rainbow Warrior would not be the best place for a highly sensitive person because we need to pick how to use our abilities, and using sort of physical strength and courage in the face in a very highly stimulating situation is not a good place for us. Have I increased my focus? No, I couldn't have. I already am as focused on it as a person can be. I saw it coming in my 20s when I was in a class on international development and saw the way development was going to go in different countries over the decades, how it's going to increase, and how birth rate is decreasing, and the use of fossil fuels and all of that. And, I mean, not birth rate, but death rate is decreasing so that infants live longer. So we have overpopulation, overconsumption, the two of them together make for the problem we're dealing with. And so, but I made these exceptions because I see it as not political, but science. But I am trying to be careful about anything that's political because I want to include all highly sensitive people. And I don't want them to feel that this is mainly a movement, as some people call it. I'm not fond of that term, with a political orientation. Oh, I know. Yeah. So when I mentioned climate change in the movie, somebody somehow got a hold of my email or something, or they sent a comment that they were going to drop out of this movement if it was going to be political. And they were going to call the sheriff in my town and have me arrested for fomenting rebellion and violence. Okay. I wrote back, I said, well, I'm glad to hear you expressed your views. It's fine with me if you leave this movement. It probably isn't for you. Okay, I don't think that person is with us today. So this person went on to say, do I urge HSPs to be more involved in issues concerning the climate, sort of being more dualistic rather than having a focus on yourself? You know, I found that a little judgmental because how much people are focused on themselves varies a lot with their needs, also varies. You know, both introverts and extroverts think that the others are self-centered and narcissistic because extroverts will talk more about themselves and introverts think more about themselves. And so I think I understand the feeling that many people are not thinking enough about the climate problem, but I think trying to understand what's going on inside them as being focused on themselves. Well, sometimes focusing on yourself is necessary if that's what's going on. Questions about the trait. I'm going to tell you the 5 to Thrive, which you've probably heard, but it's a good way to understand it because someone has said, how do you train yourself or become better in accepting who you are and feeling validated, being a very highly sensitive person? Someone else would like a list of a few things I could do. Help me move on and live a more rich and balanced life. What should I focus on? So we call them the 5 to Thrive. The first one is to understand the trait, really believe the trait is real. And you can do that by reading the research, or one of the others in the list is being around other highly sensitive people will just make that number 2. Because as soon as you're in a room full of them, or you see that 300 of them are on the screen with you, you know it's got to be real. Another one is reframing your life, because a lot of our self-esteem or our self-concept comes from experiences when we may be the negative part, comes from times when we failed or we made a decision that we thought that we regretted later, or that other people have told us we did something wrong. I love the story. I heard it several times of little kids being given a surprise birthday party and running to their rooms and locking the door. And the parents are very upset when they remember that as a horrible thing that they did. They didn't even understand why, but they were overstimulated and shocked, and they just couldn't handle it. So without that explanation of, usually it's overstimulation or trying to protect ourselves from overstimulation, someone gives us a promotion and involves a lot of travel or a lot of holding meetings. And we just know we're not going to be good at that, but we may not know that that's why we're saying no, or we may feel ashamed of having to say no because somebody else would be glad to have that job. So reframe those things that have influenced you so much. And then another one is to work on those childhood issues that are still plaguing you and keeping you from fully using your sensitivity. And then you need to change your lifestyle and not try to live like the other 80%. And that's huge. And it's hard to do it because sometimes we feel like we're missing out on something, but it's just necessary. So, and the one big problem, as I said, is overstimulation. So somebody asked me about my best advice for a sensitive person to handle a non-sensitive world. And then they said, practice meditation, mindfulness, yoga, self-compassion, or something else. Well, I'm very big on that list. It's right there. And as some of you know, I'm particularly big on meditation, and among kinds of meditation, I've been doing transcendental meditation for over 50 years. I almost never miss because it's so pleasurable. It's so much what I need. This morning, I fell asleep during it because I've been a little short of sleep. So good for me. That's what I needed. It's very accepting in that regard, and it's very deep rest. Mindfulness, I've done a lot of study of this, is a very good system of meditation for developing awareness of your body, awareness of what's going on. It was key in Buddhist teachings of how to reach nirvana. The difference is that it's, and TM comes from the Vedanta tradition, which was actually prior to Buddha, but and Buddhism became Buddhism, and Vedanta became, well, people think of it as a part of Hinduism, but it's Vedanta. It's the Vedas, or the end of the Vedas. The Vedas were things you recited, but by the end, they realized that reciting things was not the key to what they wanted. So TM involves some meditation that goes to pure awareness, which if your mind is on your breathing or your thoughts, you can't slide down into pure awareness. So it's just a different form of meditation. The brain waves are different. And I think I've written about it somewhere on my blog. Yoga is great for some people. It's great combined with meditation. Very good. Self-compassion we want to have. And I wonder, what is the psychological explanation of HSP's reaction regarding this question from the self-test? When I have to compete against someone or perform a task during observation, I get so nervous or insecure that it goes a lot worse than it otherwise would have. Well, I wrote that question because I knew it was true. And the problem is over-arousal. When people are watching us or just learning something and the teacher is commenting, all of that, we're going to be more aroused. And nobody performs well when over-aroused. Nobody performs well when under-aroused. There's an optimal level of arousal, and we want to be in the middle. but highly sensitive people easily get pushed to the over-aroused place before other people do. And this is why it's difficult to perform in front of an audience. You may be the best violinist or the best sprinter or the best diver or the best singer until you get in front of an audience or the stopwatch is running or the judges are watching. And then sensitive people often have trouble performing at their optimum. And there are lots of ways to deal with this. And I think I wrote about them in the book. But and then there was another question about, do you remember when you went to elementary school, did you have to read a text several times in order for it to stick? And is this typical for HSPs? And I think, again, it's hard to focus when you're over-aroused. So what to do about it? Well, I think understand it's anxiety. Understand it's arousal and not anxiety. There's a clever study I described in, I think, the first book about Phil Zimbardo, basically demonstrating that people who are shy or think of themselves as shy don't act shy if they're told their anxiety is being due to some loud noise. So all of the symptoms of being a little anxious, now that's the loud noise, and then they don't behave shy. So in understanding how much overstimulation is the factor that's actually causing what is then becomes anxiety, then becomes poor performance, then becomes an anxiety in the future about performing because we didn't do well last time. If we understand it's overstimulation, we can attack that problem instead. And you do it by over-preparing until you can't fail. You do it by going to the same place or doing the same performance. The same place reduces the overstimulation from being in a new place. But doing it in front of other people and inviting them to criticize you, now that really helps too. When I did my dissertation, I was very afraid of doing the dissertation defense. I put it off most of my life because I was worried about that. When I did it, I rehearsed it a lot, rehearsed it in the same room. I was able to. And I had this joke with myself that, I had an audience say the worst things they could. Like one said, that was so bad, it makes me want to throw up. So, and then I said to myself, there will be 3 things that will go terribly wrong that day. And they did. And I just said, okay, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. So preparing for the unexpected really helps. And bringing a friend along can help. And also being confident that the more you do the thing, the less anxious you'll be. I have zero anxiousness about speaking to all of you or in any other group speaking about high sensitivity because I've done it so much. And then related to that is remember why you're doing it. It's for the audience, not for yourself. So just think of them and what they need. A little hard when all I've got is a row of names up here. But be overstimulated if we're seeing your faces or if we were in a big room all together, unfortunately. So that was a good time to stop because it has to do with what we were talking about meditation. It has to do with the importance of downtime for us, all kinds of downtime. One of the nice things about TM is if you have a thought, you just go back to thinking the mantra, which is you don't concentrate on the mantra. It's just basically go back to diving deep. And no, the thoughts are actually considered a part of the process, not something to get rid of or to observe, but just part of the process. So, because when I'm in some circumstances, I sit down and meditate and I think most of the time, and that's what needs to be done. I'm not saying you should, but sometimes I can't help it because our nature is to process things. So I got up and walked out to the kitchen and put a couple of bowls into some water because they were needed to soak and to clean later. And I thought to myself, this is how I get my downtime is I just do some household chores sometimes. And during it, I was thinking entirely about this talk. Just read a chat. So downtime is very important for us. But the reason why I like meditation is because it's the most efficient. You go very, very deep in 20 minutes. So, but doing your chores without the radio on or talking to anyone, taking a walk by yourself, your mind will be full of processing, and a lot of it is unconscious or barely conscious. So let's see where I was. Let's see. Oh yeah, we were just going to talk about advice for non-sensitive people for interacting with sensitive people. So I presume that there might be one or two of those people nearby, or these are the points that some of the points is a big question and has a lot to do with individual differences. Some of you know that I've backed off a little bit from doing interviews and things like that about HSPs because I'm writing another book, which you're all going to want to know about, but I'm not talking about it yet. But one of the problems that I came to feel, and I came with the pandemic, was being asked to make generalizations about highly sensitive people. And you know, this is what I'm doing today, is making generalizations, but I really want to emphasize the importance of your individuality, that we're each of us different. If we had all the pictures up, we'd all see very different people. We know we're all so different, and we so quickly gloss over that fact. So everything I've said today will have its exceptions, and you may be the exception. So please keep that in mind. Now, on the average, probably the most important thing is back to downtime. People who aren't as highly sensitive as us don't need the downtime as much, and they often feel like we have abandoned them or don't want to be with them or want to do something else more than we want to be with them. So we have to help them understand, and they need to understand that it's not a rejection, that we'll come back even nicer than we were before if we get our downtime, maybe a lot nicer. And understand that there are times when, for the sensitive person, enough's enough. You know, even wonderful, something wonderful, we can't even take something wonderful for as long as other people can without having some time off to recharge. But you don't let sensitive person dominate life either. You work on compromise. Sometimes A, sometimes B, sometimes somewhere between A and B. Don't win arguments with a highly sensitive person by overstimulating them. It will come back to you. And I know this happens. You know, the more you yell and scream, eventually the highly sensitive person backs down, but it will not work in the long run because that develops bitterness or strategies to get their way anyway. It's not good. Keep a reasonable tone of voice, stick to the issue. Don't kitchen sink it, throw in every other thing in this argument that has been bothering you. Just stick with the issue. Don't use name calling. I have to say, in the sensitive person in love. No, I won't say that. But yeah, name calling or diagnosing, you know, you're just like your mother, or that's obsessive compulsive, or you're always so depressed, you're just not any fun. You know, those kind of things, keep that out of disagreements. And notice how much life improves with the highly sensitive person when you do these few things. But relationships are all so different and so unique, it's hard to give general advice. And especially at work, and now we're coming to the subject of work, you can't ask for special treatment because of your sensitivity unless you are adding a lot to the company, so that losing you or losing your productivity would be a great loss. So otherwise we add to that image of sensitive people as being whiny or fussy or difficult. So show how much what you need will add to your productivity. Or in a relationship, how much nicer you are to be around when you get what you need. And then getting into work, someone mentions that they work more from home, as many have, and for them it was pleasant. However, now the norm seems to be now we can finally all get together again. And I don't feel that way, not as before at least. How do you experience the norm around this, and how can you as an HSP handle this societal norm? Well, it's back to trying to teach people that everybody's not the same in a gentle way, expanding their consciousness of what people are like. And it's fun to feel like you're in a group in which everybody agrees. And it's not fun to feel like you're the one person in the group who doesn't agree, because we're such social beings. But I think maybe you expand the consciousness by saying, yeah, it's more fun for some than others. I have a friend who wrote a whole book during the pandemic because she finally had some peace and quiet in her home, or something like that. And the phrase that I love is, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. We've all been in different boats. Some were leaky boats, some were ocean liners that you hardly felt a thing. You just enjoyed yourself. If it was a longer trip, how much fun. So we can't make generalizations about anybody during the lockdown. Some suffered horribly from the isolation and the loneliness, and some had their favorite person with them and just enjoyed. People who had people they didn't like with them maybe suffered the most. So work situations are so different. But I would say that the most important thing about work is that the social part of it be good for you. There are toxic work environments. There's lots of power and ranking and all those issues going on in work environments. So just as there are better families and families that are hard to live with, there are jobs like that. And I think that's part of why so many sensitive people are self-employed. And I think sensitive people can do almost any job if they can make it right for their sensitivity. Because I know someone who was a police officer, and that would seem to me impossible for a sensitive person, but probably they were a high sensation seeker too, which helps. But they said that they used their sensitivity to know, to feel what was going on the street, what was going to happen, what was coming down. And they were very successful at not getting into bad situations because they could see ahead of time what was going to happen. So that's using your sensitivity, but it has to not be too stimulating. I don't know how this person managed the stimulating part of the job. I imagine that having a partner you work with whom you like would be tremendously helpful. Well, we've seen movies about it where it looks like a lot of fun to be a partner in one of those relationships. So it's the environment that we're going to deal with, and especially the social environment, also the physical environment, the ethics. If you're in an organization where the ethics are not good, then that can be very hard on a sensitive person. Someone mentioned being a teacher. Both me and my mother work in a school, and we're exhausted after a day of work. And then the question is, what type of work is suitable for HSPs? And I just want to say, teachers work so hard. Oh, God, what a difficult job. And they're also really good. That's why they go into teaching. And then the same is true for nurses and doctors. Is there a way to make the teaching not so painful rather than you're having to quit or destroy your health? And I've talked to teachers who talked about this and some of the boundaries they've put on situations. And for instance, one person stopped grading homework, had the kids grade their own homework, pass it around the room, and they learned a lot from looking at each other's work and grading the homework. Another teacher told me, I don't know how it is in Sweden, but where she worked, you had to be available 24/7 all the time to parents if they wanted your help. No, you have to say no to that. Now, if you can't in your school district. It may be necessary to change jobs. Many sensitive people teach in private schools, which can be helpful, although there are other issues in private schools. But especially parents who are spending a lot of money on this education and they want it to go a certain way. But maybe you can be a tutor. But try to do the thing you want to do in the way that a highly sensitive person has to do it. Questions related to research. I would like to know if, and the answer is yes, the highly sensitive person test is being updated for adults and children. And if so, when will they be ready? We're going very slowly. We're all really busy, and we are a committee. So it's going to be a while. And we also want to, of course, run it by many other people, but also be sure the wording will work in a variety of languages so that we don't have trouble translating anything. And there's nothing really wrong with the original test that works so well on brain for brain scans and things like that. But it doesn't represent sensitivity very well. And people mess around with doing what's called factor analyses and don't get the right factors, the different sort of subsets of. So we need something that represents depth of processing, which I didn't know. I didn't think about it when I wrote the test in 1996. I was obviously much more aware of the overstimulation part. And then it had too many negative items, which, well, the way I did it was write about 60 items, and then we look for those that correlated with each other, and the negative items correlated together very well. But that was something we could have spotted and written more positive items and included those. So we had a few like conscientiousness and rich inner life and appreciating the arts and music. And those ended up being called an aesthetic factor, which it wasn't. First of all, it was a positive item factor, but it did not represent depth of processing adequately. So we're revising it. A theory that seems to dominate within personality psychology is the big five. One of these is neuroticism. Could this trait be a version of high sensitivity? Oh, don't get me on the subject of the big five. I've never been very delighted with it, partly because one of its big promoters claims that extroverts are happier than introverts and feels they've done a lot of research to demonstrate that, which isn't true. It's the measure of happiness that they use that is the problem. But we're not here to talk about introversion and extroversion. The way it was devised was to ask people to give the terms that they use to describe other people. And so it is basically a lexical or a language measure. The items come from the words we use to describe other people. And they work very well in many cultures because we all use similar words, because what are they? They are what we can observe. And high sensitivity is hard to observe. Also around introversion, it's easy to describe extroverts, but the descriptions for introversion are all over the place because you can't easily describe to someone who's not doing anything or saying anything. And the same for sensitive people. If they're being quiet, if they're holding back, they could be afraid, they could be stupid, they could be aloof, they could be feeling inferior, feeling superior, shy. I mean, so it's been hard to observe sensitivity. And therefore, there is not a very good correlation between the big five and any measure of sensitivity. Now, the big five has factors, and one of the factors is neuroticism. There's 5 factors. One is introversion, extroversion. One is agreeable and disagreeable. One is open-mindedness versus closed-mindedness. One is neuroticism, and I'm not sure I've said 5, but I always, if there's 5 things, I usually forget one. So there is a correlation, of course, between the HSP scale and neuroticism, because a lot of the questions are about being worried, and sensitive people by nature worry about things. We're looking to the future, and some of those look like great opportunities, and some of those look like threats, but we're seeing more threats and more opportunities than other people are. So we seem more neurotic. And of course, if we've had a bad childhood, that's even more prone to have some neuroticism. Just means negative affect, depression, and anxiety mainly. So that's why there's a correlation there, and we're expecting to still have the correlation with the new scale, but maybe less. There's also a correlation with introversion, because if 70% of highly sensitive people are introverts, then there's going to be a correlation. It means they tend to go together, but not perfectly. And open-mindedness, that also tends to go with high sensitivity, but not perfectly. And none of them are large enough to say that the big five measure sensitivity. And the last thing we're going to talk about are other traits and diagnoses. What about sensitive people and giftedness? Well, it's hard to define giftedness, or hard to measure. We have rough ideas of people who are quite extraordinary in some way, but it's supposed to be in the United States, it's a common number. I don't know so well in Sweden, that 3% of people can be considered gifted. Just it's the top 3%. But if we're 20 to 30% of the population, then we can't all be gifted. Now, it could be that we are and the measurement is poor, but then that still requires changing the definition of what is gifted. However, I think if people are tested on IQs, for instance, IQ tests, for instance, it's quite likely that sensitive people score not as well because of over-arousal, depending on the situation of the test. And there are other blocks to our creativity. I know this as a therapist, I was always amazed by the dreams that sensitive people had. And when I would take them to my supervisor, sometimes they would say, no one could have a dream like that. They're making this up. I'd say, no, I know about those kind of dreams. I have them too. So creativity is a part of giftedness, and intense dreams are a part of creativity. And there's one study showing highly sensitive people as more creative. So we just play that easy, like saying that we're wiser or more virtuous. We also don't say we're more gifted, but the gifted people will say that all gifted people are highly sensitive, even though that's what I was a featured speaker at a gifted conference because of sensitivity. So there is that. In fact, when I was trying to find the term sensitive in the psychological literature, that was sensitivity to medications, being sensitive as a parent, and sensitivity as a part of giftedness were the only places where I found the reference for the term. How do you distinguish sensitivity from trauma sensitivity, or I'm going to use the psychiatric term post-traumatic stress disorder? And they are different, although with any diagnosis, it could be that you really are highly sensitive and don't have that thing. It could be that you're not highly sensitive and do have that thing. It's being mistaken the other way. Could be very often that both is going on, and sometimes neither is going on. But very often sensitive people have post-traumatic stress, not very often, but some will. And it's probably has something to do with differential susceptibility, that we're more susceptible. Though I saw an interesting study of Israeli soldiers, and I'm trying to think, they didn't use a measure of sensitivity, but it was one that seemed to be very close. And basically, they found they were sensitive, more sensitive. Soldiers in training were more frightened, but they were less likely to get hurt or be traumatized during battle. Why? Well, they imagined everything that was going to happen and were ready for it, or had rehearsed it more. They were better prepared. So it's sometimes the tough guys that end up with post-traumatic stress syndrome. But the difference is, first of all, you're born highly sensitive. In PTSD, you can identify the point in one's life when they were traumatized or began to be traumatized. Also, sensitive people are sensitive to everything, but that's positive and negative, whereas PTSD is sensitivity specifically to triggers that remind you of the original trauma. So those are some of the differences. Someone asked about the relationship to obsessive compulsive disorder. It seems to be common that people with OCD also are HSPs. Well, this is one of those places where we don't have the research on that. I know that I knew someone who was head of the OCD organization in the United States at one time, and she was quite certain that was true, and was fine. It makes sense. The nature of OCD is a kind of over preparation for something that could go wrong, and that could be there, just like anxiety. Then I had a number of questions. Here's where I'm going to get wiggly and squirmy. I'm going to wiggle out of these. They're about ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. And I used to be able to answer these fairly simply because I just looked at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Here's the list of symptoms that help you decide whether this person has this or they don't. But two things have happened. One is that there's been a lot of discomfort, understandable discomfort around this, giving people labels that say you have a disorder. So, and there's been a whole neurodiversity movement. There's also been the problem, most of the diagnoses had to do with children, and now we're looking at adults, and their functioning is all over the place, and they've often adapted well, or we have found ways in which they contribute a lot to society. So then that's made people pretty touchy about anything that I say on the subject, and I'm not an expert, so I've just kind of backed out of it more. There is some research that shows brain differences between people who have ADHD and those who are highly sensitive, and Bianca Acevedo has written an article on that along with schizophrenia. I think she was also looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are differences in the way the brain operates, but it's not a perfect study because we couldn't look at them all doing the same task. It was comparing experiments with slightly different tasks. But people I know who know autism well and know sensitivity well say, no, they're not the same. But I'm not, I feel pretty confident about that, but I'm not going to go any further than that. And of course, a highly sensitive person can have the same, can be autistic also, or an autistic person can be highly sensitive. And that's true with ADHD. What I love and I really into now is diversity. We all have different brains, just like different thumbprints. And so we try to make these generalizations in order to help with treatment and helping them to function well. But then it's understandable that at some point, people told they have a disorder may rebel and say, I seem to be doing very well, better than that person in some ways. I don't need all this help. So, and the same spectrum is found, by the way, with deafness. Some people want to treat deafness and help people enter normal society, and others say, we don't need that. We have our own little group over here. And so that's my answer. And there was questions about sensitive people and getting older and retiring, and it's again the same storm, different boats, same beautiful ocean that you floated out into, but different boats. I think how people feel about retirement is often a good expression of how they have been in life. The other one is about how we might get along with people with psychotic traits, and that's again no research on it, and it would vary a lot from person to person. So I'm about out of time, or the amount of time that I allotted for myself, because I knew that I get I can be really burned out by doing these things, even though you can tell I'm thoroughly enjoying myself, but I still do get tired. So I wanted to end with a poem because I love to watch myself cry. Whenever I try to end with a poem, I end up crying when I'm reading the poem. So you get a chance to see me as an emotional leader, because that way you'll feel more free to cry when the opportunity is appropriate. I'm not sure it's appropriate when I read a poem, but I wanted to read a poem called A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William Stafford. If you can find that poem, read it. But the problem is it's about elephants in a circus in part. I'm not sure in Sweden you have the circus gets out off the train, and then the elephants walk in a line to the park where they put up the big top. But I just don't know if that ever happened. It doesn't happen here anymore, but it used to happen, and it was part of this guy, William Stafford's life. I like this poet. There's reference to a thread, and I think the thread might be different things for different people, but I think of it as the pure awareness that I experience in TM. It might be some other spiritual thing. It might be your sensitivity and your faith in it as a good thing. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. So don't let go of your thread. And I am really appreciative of this chance to be with all of you. I really enjoy it. I told my husband this morning, I really enjoy doing this, and I do. So thank you for giving me the chance to do it.
And thank you. This is also where the applause normally take place.
Which is very overstimulated.
Imagine them.
At HSP gatherings, they do this now. So.
Oh yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Elaine Aron, for answering so many of our questions. And thank you for your research as well. That has given us so much knowledge about this trait, about ourselves, about our loved ones, our children, colleagues at work, and also, sorry, that wasn't the poem. We would also like to thank you for spreading the knowledge around the globe. And as you said, it takes a generation or maybe two before it's spread all over. But we believe that you're one of the ones that started this movement, if you like. So I want to thank you on behalf of tonight's participants, since they are not in picture, and also for the Swedish Association for the Highly Sensitive. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Elaine Aron. I would also like to thank the former board member Anna Frugstad and Swedish publisher of Dr. Elaine Aron's books. So thank you so much and good night.